What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back to finishing up Moon Knight, which I realized that we didn't finish up Volume 1. I need to go through and figure out the stories that we haven't finished and finish those up, because I feel like they've just been lingering too long, right? The channel feels like it's been a little chaotic recently. And so what this does here, kind of finishing out this first volume here, this kind of picks up after the events of his fight with Badir. Now, for those of you guys who don't recall that, that was basically the second fist of Khonshu, that Moon Knight was not the only one. He was not the only one to ever receive the power of Khonshu and to basically become a Moon Knight, that Badir was as well. He just kind of operated behind the scenes. Now, the reality is that's a retcon. He's a newly created character. It's just Jed McKay's way of throwing him into the story and introducing him as a new guy with a backstory of his own. But one of the things that happens here is you have a conversation that initially takes place between Moon Knight and his therapist. And one of the things she asks here is, why do you wear a mask, right? Like, what's the point of wearing a mask? And initially he starts talking about how when he wears this mask, that he's not Mark Spector, right? And he says that he's not really talking about his dissociative identity disorder, right? It's multiple personality disorder. That instead, Mark Spector in and of himself doesn't really matter. He doesn't really have any actual purpose or really even any value in the world. That in a lot of ways, he is an identity that doesn't serve a useful purpose. And that as the Fist of Khonshu, Moon Knight is a symbol, a dead man brought back in the pursuit of justice. He says, my masked face is the face of Khonshu. It's part of my vestments, the same as my costumes, right? The same way that Captain America has a shield, or Spider-Man has his outfit, or Iron Man has his armor. It's a part of who he is. And that's the reason why he wears the mask. Now, there is actually a larger motivation to this, and it's one of the cooler elements of his character. But in the midst of all this, what we end up doing is switching over to Stuart Clark. Now, Stuart Clark has been around in Marvel Comics for a long time, and originally he was a villain of the First Champions team. But the thing about this is that Stuart Clark didn't always look this way. So this guy has been a kind of tour de force when it comes to Marvel Comics. He's kind of been everywhere and been involved in a lot of different things. After his original appearances in the old Champions comics, there came a point when he was involved in Banetronics, which is actually ran by Madam Menace. It's technically part of a company called Sunset Bane, but basically, and we didn't even find out about this until Iron Man Volume 3, issue number 19, that basically she had stolen information or stolen knowledge of Stark Tech by seducing Tony Stark, and then used that to essentially build her own company, using Stark technology and then weaponizing it, and basically becoming like an underground arms dealer. In the aftermath of the original Civil War event, he actually became an information and arms broker for Frank Castle, for the Punisher. I mean, he's fought both against and for Billy Russo, the original Jigsaw. This guy's been everywhere. It wasn't really until the events shortly after, or at least during and shortly after Secret Invasion, that his face ended up getting all scarred the way that it was. Ultimately, he was believed to have been killed, and we never really found out exactly how it was that he came back. We simply just know that he did. But in this moment right now, he's basically having a conversation with a mystery man that he knows nothing about, who essentially says, I can help you destroy Moon Knight, right? I can help you bring this guy down, and essentially gives Stuart Clark the ability to access basically Steve Grant's financial accounts. Now remember, Steve Grant is one of the identities of Mark Spector, right? One of the personalities of Moon Knight. Remember, he's very similar to Batman in that way. So in a lot of ways, Steve Grant is like the Bruce Wayne persona of Moon Knight. And so what ends up happening here is there's a couple things that go on. One of the first things is that Mark Spector is visited by Tigra. And this is really just because of the fact that they're old friends, right? They were Avengers at one point. They're just kind of talking and hanging out and spending time together. She'll become a kind of unofficial member of the team. But the other thing that happens here is that Mark gets a call from Stuart Clark, who basically says, I have total command over all the funding of Steve Grant, and I know that's how you fund your midnight mission. And he's like, just right here, watch, bam. And he's like, $1 million is gone. Just like that, right? Just gone, disappeared. It doesn't exist. And he's like, I'm gonna keep on doing that unless you work for me, unless you do what I tell you to. And so ultimately he ends up sicking him on some guys, and it actually turns out to be the forces of Billy Russo of Jigsaw. And so of course, Moon Knight gets in there, starts tearing all these guys up, gets into a fight with Jigsaw, and then basically takes Jigsaw out. We don't really see it happen. It just kind of happens off panel. It's one of those things where it's like, well, now let's fight, and then you just kind of skip to the next scene. So it's kind of a foregone conclusion in terms of how this happens. But more so than that, what actually ends up going on here is that when Stuart Clark tries to call Moon Knight back in order to send him on another mission, we end up finding out Moon Knight basically traces his location. It's kind of what you expected. And then he just beats the hell out of this guy, right? He just absolutely pummels this guy. Now, one of the things that goes on though, is that before Stuart Clark is ultimately defeated, he actually starts zapping all the money of Steve Grant and reduces Moon Knight down to being a guy who's completely and totally broke. The crazy thing about this is Moon Knight says, I don't care. It was never about the money, right? right? Like my mission is to help people who are in need, right? Travelers in the night. That's my job. I don't need money to do that, right? I don't need like all these resources. I mean, money makes it easier, and you're really inconveniencing me right now. Right? He's like, but I only serve my people, those who petition for my help. And this is kind of a change of pace from the nature of Moon Knight as we've seen him in years past. It's one of the reasons why Jed MacKay's Moon Knight run is very reminiscent of like the old school Moon Knight run from like the 70s, right? Like way back in the day Moon Knight. We haven't really seen him depicted in this way in quite some time. In a lot of ways, in recent years, Moon Knight's just kind of been a guy who's there who does some things and like was on the Avengers once. And that was it. There really wasn't a whole lot going on with his character. There wasn't a whole lot of development. He had some cool stories, but outside of, Jeff Lemire's run, there really had not been a significant moment for Moon Knight. Certainly not on the same level as the kind of development that we're seeing here, which is one of the reasons why I'm just so into the story. But again, one of the other things that kind of goes on is that where the answer he gave his therapist is that the reason why he has the mask on is because Mark Spector doesn't matter, all that kind of cool stuff, that what he actually says here is that he has a family. He's got like a wife and daughter, right? That he found out that he has a kid, and that they essentially ended up taking off to the other side of the world, that they never wanted him to come after them because he was just so dangerous, right? The life he lives is dangerous. His dissociative identity disorder, his multiple personalities make him dangerous, right? It's the kind of thing where in a lot of ways, Mark Spector has lost more than he gained. And that's why he told Tigra the real reason that he wears this mask is because he doesn't like to have to look himself in the face whenever he's looking in a mirror, that he can lie about who he is. And this is stupendously important because what this really does is it seems like is Jed MacKay hitting on why it is that Mark Spector even has multiple personalities in the first place. That usually, as I understand it, when it comes to developing multiple personalities, it's usually a highly traumatic event that leads to that taking place. That a personality manifests as a coping mechanism for a traumatic experience. And that while Moon Knight has had all kinds of traumatic experiences over the course of his life, this just feeds into it. But the motivation being he doesn't like who he sees when he looks in the mirror, while the front-facing idea of that is that's why he puts on the mask. I would go as far as to say that's why the personalities of Steve Grant and like Jake Lockley and Mark Spector, why they still continue on. Because at the end of the day, he's running from his own history. He's running from his own past and the kinds of things that he's been involved in here. And so what we end up doing is basically switching over to a guy that meets with him and says, I know who it was or who it is that's been attacking you from behind the scenes. I know the person who was basically the one that sent that sent like Badir after you, or at least told him of your location. I know the one who sent Stuart Clark after you. Like, I know what's going on here. Now, this kid that appears to him is simply a kid named Terry. Now, there's a lot more to him than there initially appears to be. And in fact, there's more history to him than I think most people know. But the thing about this is that he essentially says like the person who's basically been coming after you, the person behind all this is Soldier. Now, one thing to know, and when he leads Mark Spector to like the base of Soldier, there's like a picture of Soldier with Hydra tattoos, things like that, obviously alluding to the fact that Soldier has a sketchy history. And this is not like a faked photo. This is an actual photo. And so all the evidence really points to Soldier as being the one that's behind this. Now remember, Soldier is one of the people that Mark Spector had helped, kind of one of his inside guys that he's largely been working with. And so in essence, it's almost like he was betrayed from the inside. Now, as he's hunting for Soldier and trying to figure out what's going on, there is a point where he switches over to this conversation with his therapist. And one of the things that goes on, and it's kind of a monologue that sort of takes place here, which is a little lengthy, so bear with me, but it's exceedingly profound and probably one of the best monologues that Mark Spector has. That as he's talking to his therapist, that what he says here is there's being raised Jewish and then there's being raised by a rabbi, right? Because Mark Spector is Jewish. And he says, my father was the kindest, gentlest man I've ever known, but there was never anything kind or gentle in me. He was a man of peace. He hated violence, and I thought that made him weak. A weak man serving an indifferent God. Because those were our stories, weren't they? We lost our homes, our land, we were enslaved and then escaped out into the desert, and from then up until now, we took our licks from practically everyone. My father taught me it was our perseverance that was our greatest quality as a people. How we never gave up our faith, our laws, our covenant with God, how we would laugh to keep from crying, no matter what happened to us. So when I died in Selma, can you blame me for accepting Khonshu Khonshu's offer. I put aside a god who had let terrible things happen to his people, a god who I had never seen, never heard, in favor of a god who spoke right to me and promised, join me, be my son, and together we will get things done. And the response that this therapist offers is, no one can blame you for wanting to live. But he says, that's just it, isn't it? All my life, I thought that my father was weak because he was kind and gentle and would never raise a hand in violence. But he would have died before he broke faith with God, before recognizing another God. That the Bible says, you shall never have other gods before me, for I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God. When it came down to it, I was the weak one. I sold out everything I had been raised to believe to save my own neck, to further indulge my addiction to violence. My father's God took us out of Egypt. My new God kept us there. And when he's asked the question, do you regret that choice? His response is, of course I regret serving Khonshu. I got my life back, and what good did it do me? I buried my father, I killed my brother, my friends, Frenchie, Crawley, Gina, and her boys. The lucky ones just hate me for what being a part of my life did to them. The others are all dead. And when I was asked by my God to take down the Avengers and put boots on the world's neck, I did it, and I did it well, because that's what I've always done. As a Marine, as a mercenary, as Moon Knight, I did what I was told was the right thing to do, no matter what my eyes, my ears, my soul told me. But did it help a single person? No. And now my kid and her mother are an ocean away because they're scared of me. You couldn't understand before why I take being the Fist of Khonshu so seriously when it's cost me so much. And he said it cost me everything. He says it's because I don't have anything left. If I'm not the Fist of Khonshu, whatever I choose to understand that as, when I'm just Mark Spector, the man who makes the wrong choice every time, the man who threw away his religion, his heritage, killed what family he didn't bury, the man who brought harm and trauma to everyone who ever cared about him, the man who can't breathe from the guilt closing over his head, thick as seawater and twice as bitter. No wonder I developed dissociative identity disorder, because I'd rather be anyone else other than that guy. How's that for honesty? This is probably one of the single greatest monologues in the history of Moon Knight, and it explains his character so well that the reality here is Mark Spector is just a guy who runs. He's a guy who feels like he betrayed himself. He betrayed himself and everything he stood for, everything that was important to him. He threw it all away just in the name of basically surviving, right? In the name of like wanting to live, to continue his addiction to violence, his idea or his life as a mercenary, killing people, destroying things, right? Being the total antithesis of everything his father believed and everything he was raised to believe. And so in the midst of this great big huge monologue, of course, there's a point where he realizes there's a perimeter breach, and then ultimately ends up traveling to that location to find that Soldier is basically locked up. And of course, he ends up, or at least has the idea of freeing Soldier, but there's a walkie-talkie there. And he's basically told by a disembodied voice that Mark Spector has two options, that in the end, Soldier was framed. Soldier did have a history with Hydra, but Soldier's not the one who's basically turning against Mark Spector. He's not the one that's ratting him out, right? He's not the one that's working against him behind the scenes, that it's somebody else who's doing it, the person on the other side of this microphone. And that's when he says, like, Mark Spector, I have watched you. I have watched you work. I have watched you function. I've watched you do everything that you do. You are a selfish and a terrible man. So here is the option I will give you. Either you can leave Soldier there and save yourself, or you can stay there, try to free Soldier, and you can die, right? You can try to cut the chains, you can try to remove them, but they're old chains, the rusted chains. It's going to be ridiculously difficult to do. There's epoxy in the keyhole, right? It's not going to be a simple thing of picking a lock and getting him out. You're going to have to make the choice, and this bomb's already ticking. So the question is, if you pop that acetylene torch that's built into your glove using the last little tidbit of money that you have, if you decide to use this and you decide to cut that chain, the question you have to ask yourself is this: what's going to happen first? Are you going to be able to free Soldier and leave, or is the bomb going to go off? And ultimately, the bomb explodes. Now, of course, Mark Spector is able to get Soldier out of there, and that's when he's met by the arrival of Terry. And that's when Terry says, like, I underestimated you, Mark Spector, right? This is going to be ridiculously fun. You and I are gonna have an absolute blast. And that's when he says, you can call me the Zodiac. Now, here's the thing. This is not a new creation by Jed MacKay. The Zodiac's actually been around since Dark Reign. Now, whether or not Jed MacKay is gonna change the nature of the Zodiac, we're not entirely sure. But the way it originally functioned is that Zodiac was basically a fan of anarchy, which according to the classic definition, essentially calls for the removal of all power structures. And depending on what kind of other political philosophies you apply it to, communism, things like that, even the removal of money. But the belief that people can can function without any sort of power structures at all. Traditionally, you could call it like a return to a state of nature, where people just kind of existed out there in the world, but there was no real ordered government in the traditional sense. Now, I'm sure somebody somewhere might say, well, no, that's not really what it means, and okay, sure, whatever. But the thing about this is that Zodiac largely has always worked to remove power structures as they exist. Initially, during Dark Reign, it was the aftermath of Secret Invasion and the fact that Norman Osborn and his guys had been put in charge of S.H.I.E.L.D. It was always kind of operating behind the scenes, launching these small potshot attacks. But the thing about this is that this appearance of Zodiac is pretty short-lived, right? I mean, like, Mark asked the question, like, are you gonna kill me, Terry? Like, go ahead, you know, I'll come back just like I always do. He says, and then I'm going to put you through a wood chipper, which is probably something Moon Knight would do. But in the end, the response of Zodiac is, why would I do that, right? It's such a waste. One of the funny things about this, and I'm sure you guys can draw the parallel like that, it looks like Jed MacKay is basically turning Zodiac into like Moon Knight's version of the Joker, right? Where he's like, I want to help you, right? Like, I want to break you. I don't want to kill you. I want to break you. I want to help you. I want to make you better, right? I want to improve on you. It's a kind of just psychopathic mentality, but it's pretty nuts. Now, in the midst of this great big huge fight, of course, because of the fact that Zodiac really goes to make the move with the intention of taking out Mark Spector, or at least damaging him in such a way that it would basically break him mentally if Zodiac were to kill Soldier, that you end up having Reese, right, the vampire assistant, essentially, of Moon Knight, who goes running off to an ally. And that when that happens, she's like, Mark Spector needs you. Like, he absolutely needs you. You have to come and help him. And so in this moment, when Zodiac is going to kill Soldier, that this help basically arrives on the scene. And no, I was as disappointed as you guys were. It's not Blade. A part of me was so hoping it was gonna be Blade, and I feel like it was just a massively wasted opportunity by Jed MacKay. It really would have been cool if it was Blade, and we just had him appear as a kind of thing here. The real question you have to ask is, would Blade have just killed Reese on the spot, right? Because she was a vampire, and Blade takes no prisoners. He don't ask questions. But ultimately, it ends up being Badir who basically saves Mark Spector, despite the fact that the two of them are essentially enemies. And because Badir has a history as a doctor, he actually ends up treating Mark Spector, and then ultimately ends up, as Mark Spector is kind of, recovering, or at least, kind of passing out a little bit, he's conscious enough to be able to hear. So he's kind of in that space between like asleep and awake. You guys know what I mean? You kind of wake up at like 2:30 in the morning, you're a little asleep and a little awake at the same time. But essentially Badir basically tells his story to Mark Spector, right? In saying that in his younger years, he was a very, very serious person, right? He was born in Luxor, Egypt, that his parents were both doctors, and that he took after them, becoming a doctor himself. And he says, I was as serious a child as I am now a man. I excelled in academics, took to my studies with a desire to learn. I was a model student in all subjects, at the top of my class, even as a child. But when I compared myself to my peers, to my family, to everyone I met, I found myself wanting. It seemed everyone else had something that I did not. And he says, I never felt the presence of God, not like any of the others did. And he says, I studied the Quran and all these other religious texts as much as any of the other subjects did. My recitations were perfect. My prayers and practice were flawless. And he says, but it was merely rote to me. I could not make the spiritual connection that everyone I knew seemed to. And this worried me. What was missing in me? I was a very rational child, and it seemed to me that if I followed the correct practice, then I should get the correct result. And he says, but that was not the case. And it hurt me incredibly deeply. He says, outwardly, I followed the correct practices. I attended prayer, I studied, I did everything that was expected of me. But inwardly, I grew to be a strict rationalist. I believed in nothing that I could not see or touch. And he says, I grew to be an adult in such a way. I followed my parents into medicine. I was a respectable man. I had very few friends, but I am not friendly by nature, so it mattered little to me. He says, I kept my lack hidden so that I could fit in. It was a good enough life, all things considered, better than many have, until it was taken from me. And he says, it was that night I was walking by myself, as I often did. There's always danger in walking alone at night. There were stories of strange attackers, right? Obviously, speaking of vampires, things along those lines. That ultimately, he was attacked by one, but then he was brought before the statue of Khonshu. And when that happened, Khonshu appeared to him and offered him the ability to have his life saved, offered him the ability to serve as the other hand of Khonshu Khonshu opposite of Mark Spector, and that he would continue living on. That much like Mark Spector himself, where Mark didn't really feel the presence of God because he saw the terrible things happening in the world and couldn't really rationalize the idea that if God truly loved the children of this world, why would he let such horrible things happen to him, right? That kind of disconnect, that sort of hypocrisy that in his mind didn't seem to make any sense. Badir did the exact same thing. The difference here is that he was highly rational. If it cannot be acknowledged by his five senses, as far as he was concerned, it simply didn't exist. And God fell into that purview. That God was not something he could see or touch or taste or hear or anything like that. That you had to rely strictly on faith in order to truly believe that God was there. But that Khonshu physically appeared to him. Khonshu spoke to him. He could smell Khonshu. I don't know if he could taste Khonshu, it'd be weird if he did, but you guys understand that Khonshu confirmed his five senses, and that in that moment, he basically felt a connection that he hadn't felt before. He was drawn to this idea. And so as Mark Spector is basically wrapped up, and as he is entombed, the response of Badir is that once the day passes, and once you're able to heal and you come back out in the night, you'll actually come out stronger than you were before. And so in response to all this, because the bomb had basically exploded in the Midnight Mission, and because of the fact that the Midnight Mission was completely and totally torched, that in the end, with Steve Grant's money being gone, the questions asked by like Reese and Tigra, like, what are we gonna do? But as they're heading back to the mission, the various people across the neighborhood are all greeting them. And in the end, as far as Mark Spector's concerned, that's the thing that matters most. That while they have lost their money and while the Midnight Mission is in shambles, the thing that's the most important is people thank them for their service. That people see Mark Spector as a protector, a person that keeps him safe or keeps all of them safe. And so in the end, he basically sets up a chair in the Midnight Mission. The whole thing's totally torched, but it's one of the coolest looking Moon Knight scenes ever. And he says, I'm Moon Knight and I'm not going anywhere. So in essence, the stage is set, and Zodiac is now the main villain of Mark Spector, which in reality is the perfect choice. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.